Okay, right, we should be recording now. I don't know why it hasn't sort of come up with a usual little voice that tells you so, but anyway, we are now recording. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this month's Bristol Fundraising Group event, and we are even more delighted to welcome Joe Jeffrey, who's been inspiring us all, particularly those of us who are grant writers, charity supporters, trust and foundation specialists who have been following Jo's work for nearly a year. In fact, I think we're just coming up to the anniversary of her first publishing her compilation of trusts and foundations changing their practices, perhaps more unusually than we'd previously spotted. It was initially launched on the Trust Fundraising Hub on Facebook and has since migrated over to LinkedIn. And I know lots and lots of people have engaged with this over the last year. So Joe's going to take us through where we currently are with the list. We're going to reflect a little bit on what it's kind of telling us about the current fundraising landscape. And then we're going to look at how we can use the list to empower ourselves as fundraisers. And then what's next? So welcome, Joe.
Hi,
Uh,
Emma. I've got to
Good.
remember this is not just you and I chatting over a cup of tea because we do that
Yes,
often as well. So, nice to be here.
very good. Thank you very much. So, I just wanted to start with how did it start? What inspired you to start cataloging these things, and indeed then to share them with everybody else?
Well, it started, I think it started, well, it was published in March last year. So we are coming up for the first birthday of the list. But I started it because there were general murmurings in Facebook groups and on LinkedIn and on meetings that fundraisers were feeling that success rates were dwindling and communication with trusts and foundations was getting increasingly hard to navigate. Um, we'd had at the time Edward Gosling, Tudor Trust, Albert Hunt, Lankelly Chase all announced spend downs and pauses, but that didn't seem relevant for everybody's day-to-day experience in grant writing. And as a consultant, I'm really lucky and very privileged to have access to lots of different bits of information and different conversations. And um, what I was finding was I'd gone into a client. It was a repeat client who had gone into, and I'd taken on some work of a portfolio, a warm portfolio actually, which transpired to be actually harder than a lapsed one. Now, statistically, that shouldn't be the case. So I kind of dug into why that might have been the case, and I was finding that um, there are little bits of information that were pointing in the direction of changes, but they weren't explicitly being communicated. And it was the Gisela Graham Foundation that started this ball rolling. You know, there was the client had an initial grant, but was finding it really hard to re-engage. And there was some issues around, I think, their back house application submission processes. And then the announcement came that they were pausing. And they paused January 2024. And I'm like, right, that's important for me to remember because that name pops up in some of my clients' portfolios. So selfishly, I'm like, I need to remember that. So I put it into a spreadsheet. And then obviously with the amount of prospect research I do and the amount of portfolio management I do, I started to collate more and more information. And it went from two classifications. I think I started with spend down and pause. So we had two to start with. We've now got 10. Not by design, by default. There was no planning in this. There was no planning in any of this. And I thought, well, if it's of use to me, then it's going to be of use to other fundraisers. And I naively just went, I'm doing this, this might be helpful. And I have it was such a naive thing to do because it has a life of its own. It has now exponentially grown, and we have 200 as of yesterday. Hold on, it's changed today because I just got a message before I came on. 261 changes, but there are another two pending that I haven't put on yet. So 261 catalogue changes. They're not necessarily unique, so you will see the same names a couple of times, like the Robertson Trust, who paused last year and have reopened their streams in a phased way. But yes, what I really wanted to achieve was for fundraisers to have open, timely, and accessible information so they could manage their day-to-day workflow, which is really important for small charities who might have one fundraiser doing all income streams, and information about how you manage your day-to-day workload is key. Mike, the lovely Mike from Line Green Consulting, coined it the mega spreadsheet. Hello, Mike. And I love it. It is that. It has turned into a beast, and managing it alongside my full-time job and my full-time teenagers has been quite the task.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and we've all seen the impact of the changes. I mean, I
Yeah.
think particularly one of my clients, because I'm also a fundraising consultant and work with a range of small organizations around the country, and the impact of the Henry Smith closure in particular,
Oh,
I think has been particularly significant, and them changing, sort of essentially closing two of their major programs has had quite a knock-on impact, not least of which on the organization themselves, which they did acknowledge.
it was a
Um,
3,000% increase in applications for when they announced.
of
I
which,
mean,
you know,
it's crazy. So yeah, it's been significant actually. And I think what I wanted to do was to challenge. I know as fundraisers, we're all very passionate about our causes. And it's very easy for fundraisers to internalize the challenges out there. And I wanted fundraisers to be seen and to be heard and go, actually, it is not about a skills deficit. It's not about our writing style. Okay, we can chat about some of that perhaps later on about how we can, as fundraisers, empower ourselves to do things differently. But I really wanted this to be done for fundraisers by fundraisers. And what's been really important for me is that this is a group project. I might be the face, I might curate and manage and communicate it. There's a whole army of us, who are tagging me and emailing me and letting me know that they've come across these changes. And that's really special, actually, because at a time where you could go in the scarcity mindset, I'm not going to talk to any other organization and let them know the information that I have. It's like, let's work together to figure this out. So it's been really special to be a part of this movement and communicate changes.
yeah, no, it really has been a truly collaborative project, and it's sparked so many conversations.
Yeah.
There's a little area on LinkedIn which is feeling very special at the moment because it does
Oh,
feel
yeah.
it does feel very collaborative. It does feel very, as though we are sort of trying to buck that, I guess, instinct that we might have as so many fundraisers from so many numerous causes and charities that we may be in competition, but it does feel very collaborative. And I think, sort of that open process has been, I think it's been welcomed across the board. And indeed, I think is now being picked up by some funders that you've been in touch with and that we've
Wow.
been hearing from. So I wonder if you
Yeah.
could say a little bit more about what
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing I wanted to say that as a consultant, it does feel very special alongside other consultants. And I feel that we have a moral duty as consultants to be the voice of fundraisers who might not feel empowered. We'll talk about the power dynamic between grant makers and grant seekers perhaps a little bit later on. But I felt that, I mean, that's a whole hour in itself. Um, but I felt it was my moral duty to be able to raise this on behalf of people who didn't perhaps have a voice. So where can we go? So I think we spoke yesterday about the trends. So do we want to have a chat about I sat down yesterday and went, who are my standouts?
yeah.
Do we want to speak about that? So I think what was really pertinent for me is that the pace is incessant. I think this is what it makes it different to perhaps we've talked about the financial crisis before and the poly crisis, and I think this feels a little bit different, which I think the list somewhat quantifies in a way. So for me, the pace is incessant. And I spoke before we went live to say, even if there's a week where I feel it's going to be a bit quiet, and that was this week for me. I'm like, gosh, it's a bit quiet on the list front, only to have received 3 or 4 updates in 24 hours. And the nature is unpredictable in that it's not just one fraction of grant makers, it's across the board, and it includes lottery, comic relief, children in need, your big names alongside your smaller family trusts. And we saw Boshia Hinton close last week, which I think came as not as a surprise, but because it was on our ones to watch, which is one of my favorite categories. It's like, oh, that, when you're looking at accounts, there's always a couple of things that stand out. And even though they were on my one to watch, I didn't expect them to close within the year. I thought we'd had a good couple of years down. So yes, it's across the board. And I tend to have themes that crop up. So this last month has been early closures. We've had a handful of trusts and foundations who have communicated to us that their windows are going to be open for a certain amount of time, only to close. I mean, we had 3 guineas last week close within 3 days of opening, which is, I mean, for a small charity who fits the criteria, you don't really stand a chance. It's quite something, quite shocking. I don't think I've ever been, nothing shocks. I'd like to think nothing shocks me, but still I'm like, really? And then we had Grocers Charity not open because of the volume of applications they received in September, which is obviously a pattern and a trend we see quite often, is actually the strategic reviews and pausing come because of volume of applications, can't be managed by the grant maker's side. And, I understand that actually, like us as service delivery organizations, grant makers don't have the capacity behind the scenes to manage processes particularly well. So we're seeing a kind of domino effect at the moment. We have pauses and closures from some of your large, which displaces applications elsewhere, only to be impacted, organizations not being set up to carry the excess of applications. So it's incessant. And then we've had some interesting double whammies. So Edward Gosling announced their spend down. Legacy partners were chosen, but their capital program remained open, only for their capital program to close early last December. So there's quite a few, patterns. We had Boots Charitable Trust last year. He went from a regional eligibility criteria, decided to go nationally, and then very quickly went, we can't manage that, and then decide to go regional again. So it's been a lot of change for fundraisers to assimilate very quickly. And what I wanted the communication of these changes to do was to allow fundraisers to inform their senior management and their trustee board that this was happening. And therein, you and I spoke to you about co-authoring on Golden Ponds.
Yes.
Because I wanted a resource for fundraisers to be able to look at and take to their board or their senior management or their fundraising managers and go, actually, this is bigger than us. It might require a change of strategy and approach. Do not ignore it. Do not think you can accelerate yourself out of this by doing more applications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've just had a comment from Liz Orme saying how useful the article was. So that's obviously very gratifying to hear.
Yeah.
What we were trying to do with that was catalogue the kinds of trusts and foundations that are out there, and then set that in the context of current well, we've called it polycrisis. I think it's been called other things with words.
Don't look at Alex Evans. Don't look at Alex Evans' newsletter. You get there.
Yes. Yes, he does encapsulate a lot of rage, I think, from time to time. But yes, he's a very interesting and funny in a mordantly sort of way commentator on LinkedIn that we're we're connected to. Our paper was a lot politer than that.
Yes,
But,
we try to be. I'm trying. I'm so well behaved. I'm trying to be very graceful in my approach. But we were talking about, I think for me that the commentary nationwide from ACF and their yearly trends report, and then from 360 Giving and their grant lab, was that there's money out there.
hmm,
And I think what was being said nationally wasn't translating to what was happening on the ground.
yeah,
And I think especially for some of the brackets, so the £1 to £2 million charities, I think have been particularly affected by the changes in eligibility to some of the reopening. And I think that's quite a tough one to navigate. We've just tipped over 2 million, and what we're seeing is a refocus on, on smaller organizations, particularly Awards for All, Children in Need, Cash for Kids. They've changed their income thresholds. And sometimes that has such a negative, nobody was planning for that. And I think the biggest issue for me is not necessarily the pausing. We can get into the good and the bad practice later on, but it's the lack of communication that comes with these changes. And I think that's actually my bottom line foundational issue is the lack of good information, clear information, communicated well about these changes. There's no mandate for trust and foundations to communicate any of this. And a
yeah.
lot of it feels behind the scenes.
And a lot of that is, I think, perhaps illustrates a lack of coordination between themselves, let alone, coordination between the causes that they support and the charities that they support. And to be fair, that you probably wouldn't expect as much coordination between the charities, although, partnership and collaborative working have been buzzwords in the sector for
Yeah.
certainly as long as I've been working in it, which is rather too long now, probably. But the lack of coordination between particularly those bigger trusts and foundations, those that have umbrella bodies like the Association of Charitable Foundations,
Mm.
is surprising, I think,
I think that's my biggest
because
concern.
they're not necessarily seeing the impact of
No.
individual decisions being made individually and separately are having a much greater knock-on impact than perhaps they initially thought they might have done.
Oh, absolutely. I think, yeah, that's one of my biggest worries, that there's not conversations being had at trust and foundation level to manage the impacts of this. And as we talk about the covenant at a wider scale between government and charities, we know the decline in statutory funding and how that's affected trust and foundations, and probably one of the determining factors of the increase in volume of applications to trust and foundations. But putting the pieces of the jigsaw together is somewhat eluding them, I think, in terms of, this is having an effect on the sector and fundraisers. And I think for me, fundraisers' health and well-being, that's, a big thing is how do we manage that impact?
Absolutely. I think that's really important. And I think that really sort of points to something that we were trying to draw out in the On Golden Ponds article, which is nearly 6 months old now. So, we can probably at some point, whenever we get time, actually
That's
start to
right.
think about updating it. But it does
Indeed.
speak to that sense of a power imbalance
Yeah.
between charities and funders, and between, and not just charitable trusts and foundations, but also statutory funders,
Mm.
the extent to which they outsource their, so I don't know what to call it, their kind of angst about, what's happening in society to the charity sector and then don't resource it properly in order to be able to do that. I mean, I was reflecting earlier in the week about the sort of 20 odd years ago when the regeneration programs were starting to kind of wind down. There was a similar kind of little bit of a credit crunch, you might call it, on
Yeah.
the charitable sector at the time as those funds sort of eased up. And there was a lot of talk at the time about having to diversify your income, about collaborations and mergers and being more sort of, more agile. But I think the difference between then and now was that those regeneration funds at the time had added capacity, which then
Yeah.
withdrew. And now what we've got is core capacity having been withdrawn and the
Mhm.
charitable sector still having to step up and deliver
Yeah.
in whatever cause area. I think these things have, it's not just social causes, so social cause type charities that have been impacted by this. It's also
It's across the board.
across the board. It's
Yeah.
arts, it's animals,
Oh, yeah.
it's everybody.
Yeah, it really is. And I think what I'd love to do at some point, we were talking about the power dynamic, and what we're seeing with some of the closures is a more proactive stance from trusts and foundations on who they want to fund rather than having open programs of
Mm.
grants. Some stage, if I get capacity, I'd love to map what closed programs, because that goes back to when we did on Golden Ponds and we were assessing the list in the framework of ACF's funds and 360 Giving. But lots of the bigger funds out there don't have open programs. Not Wellcome Trust. I mean, they're very niche. Either have closed programs or very niche programs, which kind of renders that bit of money really out of the equation.
Yeah.
The power imbalance as well is something we talk about often. Um, and I think the use of language in communication or lack thereof is a real exclusionary practice.
Mm.
There's been some examples on the list of pauses of a trust who've only reopened with some incredibly awful eligibility criteria. And you're like, if you're going to pause, please just do so for the better. And there have been examples, and I will talk about those because I think it's important to say that actually with some of the pauses has come better practice. But if you're going to pause, please come back to us with better application forms and eligibility criteria that we understand and can make a decision, affirmative decision. That's what we want to do. We want to know we're in or out. We don't want
Yeah.
this opaque twilight zone. Fix the form. Yeah, absolutely fix the form. And crappy fundraising practices are,
Mm.
a godsend. But yeah, if you're going to do it, then do it better. And so there are some really great examples that I'm doing a spotlight on the Robertson Trust on Monday, who paused, they're in Scotland, they paused their grant making last May, reopened in September, have done a phased introduction of their grants. They've increased the threshold of their grants and they've increased the grant level available. They communicated beautifully through social media and their blogs. I can't see a better example. I'd love to hear from people who has experienced their application form because I haven't done one for Scotland actually. I'd like to.
Mm.
Um, but they're my kind of A-star student at the moment. I'm like, if they can do it, why can't others do it? I have a great affinity for the Shears Foundation in the north. I think they're in
Mm.
Yorkshire, whose trustee came to me and said, I want to use the list to leverage the committee to give more money. And they did,
Wow.
which is a fantastic, I know. So their grant pot has increased, their maximum grant has increased. So there's some really great practice examples. I've also been talking to the Spend Down group, who obviously have accelerated. So you've got Gower Street and Langley Chase,
Mm.
who've accelerated their grant giving to maximize impact. So actually, they've flooded somewhat the sector with grants available. However, it is mostly proactive rather than open programs. So we are seeing somewhat a balance of more money and notwithstanding those that are paused somewhat are still grant giving.
Mm.
Henry Smith, I feel, are still grant giving, even though they've paused, or there's been some, perhaps those not open, not new applications, but those that have been in receipt of funds previously, I think got maybe a roll on or an opportunity to roll on.
Yeah,
The Robertson Foundation trusted this same as well, which is really great to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the Henry Smith, they closed their two biggest programs, but they've got a couple of others that kind of
Yeah, they
run
got
at much
the summer play
smaller
schemes.
scale. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think their county grants are still, actually, no, I think their
yeah,
county grants have been wound up a while ago.
yeah,
They do a couple of other smaller, more specialist things, which, as far as
yes,
I'm aware, aren't. But it's still, the impact of that is still illustrative of a kind of
yeah,
the wider issue,
yeah.
and we're still waiting to hear what they're going to be doing. Um,
Well, you can look if you're nosy, if you look at their directors that have gone out to advert in their jobs, you can gauge
yeah,
what their priorities are going to be. We're just going to wait and see how, how they're going to do it.
yeah,
And I think going back to, I think I had a moment of realization last week that good practice doesn't always mean staying open.
mm,
Bad practice doesn't always mean closing. Is it fair and just? No, because service delivery organizations don't have the opportunity to close whilst they figure out how they're going to navigate increased demand. But I think some of those who have remained open are not showing best practice. Some
yeah,
of those who are have paused actually have done so for the better. And I think that's a hard one to square. So it's not black and white. It doesn't affect everybody's portfolio in the same way. Alex Evans did put it in a really beautiful way when he first started writing, because we had City Bridge, Henry Smith, and I think lottery changes. And I think he put it in a way that says most organizations have a Henry Smith worker, a national lottery project,
mm, yeah,
and I think that was really, that was just to me, it's like, these are the changes that are seeing, these are people's, not just our beneficiaries' lives, but our organizational staff's lives.
yeah, yeah. Because those are some of the biggest funders, across the country.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
we can all list the biggest sort of social purpose ones that are fairly broad. The Esme Fairbairns, as you say, the lottery, the Henry Smith. So, sort of changes and closures and pauses and those sorts of things do have a massive impact really across the charity sector, because they cover such a wide range of causes. The impact of smaller ones opening and closing perhaps are perhaps a little bit more niche,
Yeah.
but it's certainly sort of, I think, speaking to a sense that there does need to be a bit more sort of specificity within the grant making sector, of being clearer about what you do and you don't want to fund. Yes, we do a lot of kind of prospect research that involves digging around in charity commission documents, and a lot of
Yay.
a lot, yeah, and a lot of, and having a look through accounts and things like that. And there are an awful lot of small family trusts out there that
Yes.
say that and they're probably huge. I think that's a research project in itself, really, to sort of map all of those. And
Oh, I'd love to do that. Give it to me, but not now.
yeah, maybe that's a PhD for when I retire. Um,
Could
but
be.
that's the sense. The objects that are written into those those charitable constitutions are broad, and they're often deliberately broad to
Yes.
enable the trustees to be able to flex from time to time. But they don't, but that ability to flex, and from time to time, just leaves an awful lot of uncertainty out there,
Yeah.
because you don't know whether to just have a
Have a
go,
go.
maybe
Yeah, and because of the lack of
write a letter.
communication, but prior, I worked in an organization for 7 years as a trust and foundations fundraiser. I had a really warm portfolio where I brought new ones on. And I had good relationships with clerks, and I had good communication with prospects. It didn't ever feel like there was obstacles to getting, actually emailing a clerk or a trustee and going, can we make an application this year? Is this something you'd be interested in? And I don't, yes, there was some that kind of went into the ether, of course, but it didn't feel as problematic then as it feels now. So with
Mm,
those broad brush approaches, they're not really helpful. Yes, sometimes you can drill down into accounts and find their preference. But going back to capacity in service delivery organizations, I know I'm very privileged to be gifted that time by my clients on the whole, because it's
yeah,
something I like to do and good at. I think we all share that, Mike, yourself, me, Rachel, Sarah Jane. There's a whole merry band of us who like doing that. But not everybody has the time to do that amidst the day job and other income streams.
Absolutely. Well, I think that leads us quite neatly into kind of, how we use the list. And what can we as fundraisers do to empower ourselves to give ourselves the best chance when it comes to,
Yeah,
this complicated process of applying for grants. And as somebody has already mentioned in the chat about fix the form,
yeah,
there have been, attempts, and there are sort of, portals, for example, that try to kind of, regularize the process. But the vast majority of funders ask questions in just subtly different ways, which mean that we're constantly on our toes. So, how do you think we can use the list? Uh,
I mean, the list is helpful for your prospect research and your portfolio management and the quantification of your prospects within your portfolio. It's only as good as the information I receive. So please, do email me and message me and let me know what you are finding so we can inform each other. So I guess help me to keep the information up to date and I will communicate it as widely as I can. Um, we've always had an output measure of productivity and applications sent.
mm,
I don't think that's relevant anymore. And this is what I tell my clients, and it was actually quantified last week by Gifted Philanthropy, have done a really great piece of work on a sort of insight survey about trust and foundations, and they've interviewed some trust and foundations. So it was really nice to see what I tell my clients reflected in a bigger piece of work. Have a small, well-researched portfolio that's mostly, of course, you've got your warm portfolio. Lapsed are always going to be more approachable than your cold. And there's some really great statistics in Gifted Philanthropy. I won't share with it here because I think that's a really maybe a conversation you have with them directly, but I would absolutely look at their webinar and their research. But spend your time on prospect research rather than churning out applications. Um, Make sure you're a good fit. Advocate for yourself within your fundraising team and your in. It's easier said than done, I know. And you can send them my way. Maybe I'll have a clinic for trustees and senior managers and fundraising managers.
good
Because
idea.
we've all been in a place where, somebody's come along and gone, here's an opportunity. And like you've probably looked at it about 3 times and gone, you know what? The first time you're like, no, I don't think it's not the right time. The second time is perhaps we don't fit. And then you kind of think, no, I'm just not going to do it because we know that our time is precious and best spent on those that are likely to yield, which is hard to gauge at times. But we've all been in a position where somebody's come forward with a prospect that is not going to yield.
Yeah.
So that's what the list and on Golden Ponds, I really wanted to get that was, resources that help fundraisers advocate for themselves in a really challenging landscape. So yes, prospect research, portfolio, understand your portfolio. I mean, I'm a bit strange. I love crunching about portfolios. I'm doing an audit for an organization at the moment, and they've just passed me all their raw data from the last 5 years. And I'm tracking, okay, who's lapsed, who gives most often, and what is their likely gift. So you've got what is the gift to us, but what is the potential ceiling for that gift?
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating. So know your portfolio well. Do spend your time on analyzing that if you can, because that will inform your targets. If your target has always been 40% of your income is trust and foundations, a huge jump to 60, with a cold portfolio isn't likely to happen in the next year. You and I know that trust and foundations isn't a quick yield.
No.
It takes a slow burn, and so there's lots of people doing great things at the moment. Check out Caroline Danks's work. She did a brilliant post on ROI yesterday. She's Larkowl.
Yeah.
There's just and there's just lots of people doing lots of research that will help pull together a case for support for how to manage your trust and foundations. I want to say in the next year, next 2 years. I don't know. I don't know how long this is going to go on for.
I think we probably need to make the assumption that this is the current landscape. I mean, I think that it'll be interesting to see what the new government does. You know, it's only been in power for 6 months or just over. There are a lot of things that may change. That you've mentioned the covenant
Yeah,
upcoming, although that's about public sector relationships and the charity sector, and possibly only
yeah,
a portion of that charity sector, you know, in
yes, at best.
when all's said and done anyway. And that's only a small proportion of what we do as a sector. So I think it's clearly the dialogue needs to be much broader than that, and much more public. And I think there's still a huge amount of misunderstanding about what the charity sector does,
Oh,
as we've
yeah.
seen in some of the debates even just in the last few weeks. But just before we move on to questions, I just wanted to ask you about next steps for the list. Are we, what's next for you? Um,
Not going bonkers is always on my list, high of my list. Um, yeah, so we've got, so the first thing that's absolutely concrete is that I'm working with the University of Manchester, who have a graduate working on the list to do a deeper dive into. You and I speak very often about what are the causes impacted by these changes.
yeah,
I also want to see the geography of the changes. I had a community foundation email me the other day and said, "Oh, could you tell me, the geographical location of the list and who's been?" I'm like, I'd love to, but at the moment, I was gifted 4 days of time by the lovely Fair Collective. Vic Hancock Fell paid for my time. Prior to that, it's all been voluntary and it fits in between my clients. So I've been navigating conversations with infrastructure bodies. So I've met with ACF, IOF, MPC, all the acronyms,
yep,
to see what they're doing or what their position is on what we're seeing on the list. So those are kind of ongoing. I'd love to develop the list in a way that's more helpful. So we have geography and cause. We wanted to look at the money flow. Okay, so as a sector, are we losing money or are we gaining money with the spend downs? That's really important. The University of Manchester is top of the list at the moment. There are lots of conversations being had about phase 2 of the list. And if I get funding for that, there'll be some more work to take it forward, which I'm really excited about. But I can't do it without funding at the moment. But I have some very keen people speaking to me about helping me in the future to do things a little bit differently. We've seen a little bit of change because I was getting overwhelmed with the scale of change. You and I spoke in December. I was losing my mind slightly.
I think it's just before Christmas. Yeah,
So I've moved to a weekly newsletter and a weekly LinkedIn post, which helps me manage my time better, and the communication is now fully branded, so you'd recognize in my feed what is the list. And then I've got a Substack circle. So Monday, 8 o'clock, circles and my LinkedIn post go out, and it will tell you retrospectively what changes are happening. I also do a drop sometimes if there's information that I've been part of. Last week, I was told that there was a trust closing at the weekend. Excellent, thanks for that. He were due to stay open longer. I mean, that's cruel. It was a Sunday. I mean, who does that? So I put it a bit early. So there's always bits of information dropped. So yeah, that's where we're at the moment. I'm hopeful that we will have some more exciting news in the next coming months, but we'll see. But it's always, for me, the priority is that it stays open, timely, not behind a paywall. I want this information out there, and that's going to be top priority for whoever I work with in the future, that it remains open and accessible.
that's fantastic. Yeah, well, I've spotted at least one question in the chat so far. Um, oh, sorry, I've just slightly just I've got a couple more things just gone in there. Hang on, let me just find it again. Rosie Gitcham is asking, do new trusts form part of the scope of the list? Or is that something you'd like to open out to, or is it mostly sort of existing trusts that we're looking at? I
It
suspect.
doesn't. It doesn't include new lists, but I have had conversations about how to capture that information.
Right. Oh, right. Okay.
So there's another consultant. It's all consultants. This sector is amazing. Um, I can't remember her name. There's too many names and too many classifications in cataloguing. I spoke to her last year because she did a piece on closing. Or no, charities that have been removed from the charity commission. And I'm like, oh, that looks interesting. So
Hmm.
yes, it would be. I'd love to expand the list. We talked about closed programs. I'd like to see that on there because I think that's actually really. I think it's probably that's one of the biggest barriers to grant making is the closed programs and the impact that has.
Hmm.
I'd also like to see, and I haven't thought of a classification for it, but your fastest fingers first, the game show approach to grant applications
Yep.
because of the unjust and inequitable practice. I won't name names, but we all know the ones that open at 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning. Don't even get me started on that timing, but that's not fair and equitable. So there's absolutely scope for if I had the time. It could be a full-time job. That's the
Yeah.
thing. But yes, I'm not ruling anything out.
Great, fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to seeing all of that develop over the coming period. I think it'll probably keep you employed for at least until you retire. Um,
Can that be soon? Like next year?
yeah, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I mean, Joe's findable on LinkedIn, the T list, as she says, which has got proper branding in T colours, in fact, appears.
Strong
Yeah,
tea
it's
colours as
very easy
well.
to find
Very
on
strong.
LinkedIn. Um, and indeed, and do subscribe to her Substack articles as they appear. We've got some questions coming in. Caroline Halls is asking about the relationship with the Association of Charitable Foundations. Have you had any conversations with them about sharing your findings?
Sorry, you've kind of answered that. That was before you talked about how
Oh,
many.
right. Okay.
I
Thanks.
have, yeah,
Yeah.
I've met ACF, and we've had discussions. They don't capture the information at the moment. I'm not sure they will, but there's some influencing. I think part of what I wanted to do with the days I had with Fair Collective is to think about not only how this works on a day-to-day basis and we keep information up to date and valid, but how we use that to campaign and advocate for ourselves. So that's an ongoing piece of work. I'm nowhere near, well, closer than I was, but I'd like to see that part of this work. I'm an ex-policy officer. I used to work in government a long time ago, before children. I have a degree in sociology and social policy. It's in my veins. So I will want to take the campaigning and advocacy as far as I can.
Yeah. And are you seeing any sense of similarities or differences between what's going on in UK sort of focused trusts and foundations and international development ones? That's being asked by Camilla McClafferty. Camilla, I don't know if you're here to
I
ask
have to
that more clearly
say
in your
that's
own words.
not an area that I know anything about and could comment. I try and keep my head in the sand. I've deleted America from my psyche for the time being for my mental health.
Yep.
That's flippantly saying, of course, I'm aware of what is happening, but I don't think I know enough to make commentary on it, sadly.
And again, Kate Rowland is asking, I suppose, is similar to the conversation about the Association of Charitable Foundations. Do you think resources like Funds Online, 360 Giving and all of those sorts of things are keeping up with the changes in a way that you are? I don't think so, is my sense, but
I don't think they are, and that doesn't come with ego. If they want to, I'd love to see it. I think for me, so Three Guineas was a really good example last week. I had it on a client list who I was speaking to last week. So it was on my radar, and then it popped up on one of my uh, grant prospecting websites that I use daily. And I'm like, oh gosh, yeah, let me just check in on that. So it was available as a prospect open. When I clicked through, it had already closed. So no, I don't think they're even doing some of the sense checking
yeah.
before they put out the information. Um, 360 Giving, I've yet to have a meeting with. I am in contact with their assistant director and I have recommendations for them. Whether or not that will ever happen, but I have some thoughts.
Yeah, and just also on the list, I've got a question about portfolio management and prospect research, which I'll come to in a moment.
Okay.
But Camilla's also asking whether there's a way of checking through the list to look for a specific trust, just to kind of, is there an index for it? But
Not yet. You can control F. That is your basic function. I would love to, and I'm in conversation with developing a website which is searchable, but obviously that's dependent on some funding.
yeah.
Watch this space. I'd love it to have more functionality. But at the moment, it's a basic Google spreadsheet. That is the limit of my skill.
Yeah.
So get Control F. That's it. I'm sorry.
Yes, or yes, because it's kind of under your control. Unless you download it, you can't edit it. And obviously, if you download it, then you've only got it at one point in time. So you'll need to kind of.
You should be able to. So all the cells that are populated are frozen because I didn't want anything to happen to them. You can input data at the very last row. So if you wanted to put something in, you could. But it's easier for me to just do it, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, and Jay, just picking up on your specialism really, which is prospect research and portfolio management. I know you do a whole session on kind of prospecting on peanuts, which I've seen you do on the Small Charities Conference last year, which was great. But in 5 minutes, can you give some tips on how to go about it for those who perhaps are new to the sector or new to fundraising, trying to manage a variety of different fundraising streams?
Yeah, of course. I love the free stuff that is out there at the moment. There is no one better than Ian McClintock at Charity Excellence Framework for his volume of information. His weekly newsletters and his funding finder are so comprehensive. I just had 10 years of fundraising. For the first time, I approached a crematorium for a grant this week based on Ian's work. He helps you think a little bit sideways as to what's out there. I really like Grants Online's daily news. Not particularly, the names are familiar, so they do a daily news. Grin every Friday do a fortnight's worth of deadlines that are forthcoming. I love using them. Well, there's probably about 5 different areas. Scotland have a great, I think it's just called Funding Scotland. I really like their newsletter and their database. I'm happy to share my prospecting on peanuts slides with you so you can circulate it around. That there's free. It's on actually, yeah, I think it's in other places, which I probably shouldn't say on here. But yeah, so I think the piece of work I'm really proud of in the last few months was a small health organization, and I was doing some of their prospecting. They'd had a reasonable small portfolio, dwindling success in their trust and foundations. And what I like to do is to, as much as I can, obviously find out meeting dates and application deadlines, but more so now than ever is looking into the Charity Commission website accounts and having a look who they've funded previously and trying to find that common ground between your cause and grant makers. That's going to be your ultimate, selling point, isn't it? So yeah, I think, that's very quickly what I do. It's not it isn't rocket science, but it is time consuming. I think that's the bit, is that, do we have the time to do this? Are you granted time by your fundraising managers? Are you trusted? Do you have the skills? And I think there's some really great information coming out. There was, I think it was Fundraising Everywhere who did a piece on access to professional development for fundraisers and how there isn't enough time dedicated to that. I love Caroline Danks's reframe of how newsletters can be micro learning. It's where you can find the little bits of information. along the way to help your journey. I think I've got probably magpie eyes. I love finding different bits of data and sharing them when I can, and it's appropriate too.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about sort of being, using that, using these tools to communicate with your wider team as well.
Yeah.
And, sort of one of the people that I follow, sort of quite regularly on LinkedIn is actually an American guy called Kevin L.
Yes.
Brown, who's has this
Yes.
great
But
adage.
fundable and findable.
Yeah, findable. You've got to be
Fundable.
findable to be fundable. So
Yes.
essentially what he's saying is you've got to get your comms right. And
Yes.
particularly, I mean, we've been talking today specifically, more specifically about open access grant programs, those that, are open to anybody,
Yeah.
provided you meet the criteria, you can bang in an application and hopefully get that considered. But, I think, what one of the things that we did start to touch on Golden Ponds is the fact that that's only a proportion of the fund, the grant funding that's out there. So much of it is donor directed, and
Yeah.
therefore relies on them being able to find you rather than the other way around. And if you're not online, if you're not communicating, if you're not, if you don't have any social media or any meaningful social media, then you're not going to be as findable and as communicable with for these potential people who might come to you as, potentially, and in this case, this is where there is a competition with another charity down the road who is much, much better at it. And
Yeah.
that's certainly something that's really sort of come to my attention as I've
Yeah.
worked with a lot of small charities that have very, very minimal online presence. And it's not, in this day and age, it's not good enough to be confident in what you can deliver. You've also got to be confident in how you communicate what you deliver.
Yeah, I think I'm finding more often that parts of my audit also cover social media and website. Having said that, my previous role was I can't remember, it's a digital and fundraising. So I did social media alongside, and it was a really nice fit. I did it on 3 days a week, school hours, part time. I don't know how I did it, but it was done. So that kind of informs my recommendations to my clients is actually, what are you saying? What are your frequency? How do you communicate with a wider audience? It always forms part of my fundraising ask.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's pretty much how I work too.
Yeah.
I work with somebody in London. They run a fantastic youth service on the basis of, on the back of an open access play provision. They have when they get donors through the door, they get funding, but getting them through
Yeah.
the door, that's the challenge because they've got an incredibly old-fashioned website and they're not doing anything on social media, or not very much. So yeah, it's a bit of a a bit of a life lesson for us, I think, particularly for smalls.
It really is. It really is. I'm happy to put on my LinkedIn page if you want to come and find me, my prospecting on peanuts slides. And I'm happy. I've got a pending post that I I think I wrote actually in circles about my portfolio management. I tend to assess based, I don't think I put it on LinkedIn yet, but I tend to do assessments based on tiers. Somebody approached me and said, what are your tiers based on? I'm like, just my head. So there's no definitive hard or fast scale, but I like to look at below 1,000, 1,000 to 10,000, 10,000 and above, and multi-year. And I think what I'm finding, we're going off tangent, and I don't have a lot of time, but for me, most of my asks are, can you do a Garfield Weston for us? And I look at Rachel Cross's meme about Garfield Weston holding up the sector. And I think it's worth noting that, you can't go for your Garfield Westons if you haven't done your tier 1 and tier 2 management. Are you managing your below 1,000, your 1,000 to 10,000? Do you actually want to go for that amount of money? And what it was interesting to see in Gifted Philanthropies research is the £5,000 grant is probably the most competitive at the moment. And I think that says it all, doesn't it, about why we're finding it so hard. So I tier my portfolios and I assess against that criteria. It's in my head, it's not a standard anywhere. It's just to say, I'm happy to put that out somewhere. So that can, that can be put out somewhere, not a problem.
Brilliant. Well, it's midday. We've had a fantastic chat You've shared an awful lot of information and advice and some great tips there at the end. We'll try and share your slides. If you ping them over, we'll pop them in the Bristol Fundraising Group's LinkedIn. I think it's a LinkedIn group. So we'll try and share it in there so that people can pick it up. You can email us on bristolfundraisinggroup@gmail.com to get onto our newsletters. So yeah, thank you so much to Joe. I'm going to stop recording now, and if I can get my cursor in the right place.